Hello everyone, welcome to our English conversation program. Today I'm delighted to have you join us and to welcome our guest this month, Tony Newell, whose voice I'm sure you all are familiar with.
Hello, this is Beth Higgins again, inviting you to join us for the guest hour. Mr. Newell has been a lecturer for the past 5 years at埼玉University. I know you'll enjoy listening to him.
Well, Tony, we are very happy to have you on this program, particularly on our guest hour program.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. I'm extremely happy to be here in my new capacity on the other side of the table, so to speak. Hello, everybody.
First of all, Tony, let me begin by asking how you feel about leaving Japan after a 5-year stay.
You begin with a very sad question. To tell the truth, I feel very unhappy about it. I've had an extremely good time here in Japan for the past 5 years. Originally, I came on a 2-year contract, but that was extended, and now I really do have to go back to England because before I came, I had started some postgraduate studies, and those, of course, I dropped when I came here, so I'm going back to continue them.
Well, you said you came here on a 2-year contract. Could you explain a little more fully what brought you to Japan, Tony?
Okay, well, I came here back in 1979. The reason I came is really quite a fortuitous one. I was in the depth of revision, studying for my final exams, and one morning I heard something drop through the letterbox, and out of sheer boredom, I picked it up, and it was a careers information circular from my university. And normally I threw them away, but just once, since I was so bored, I thought I'd read it. And at the back, at the bottom of the last page, was a small insert about a job in Japan. I thought, that sounds quite interesting. And quite off the cuff, I applied that same morning, and to my surprise, ended up here in Japan a few months later. I came on a kind of exchange scheme. It's called an exchange, but it's sort of a one-way exchange because teachers come from Britain to Japan, about 40 every year. Unfortunately, no teachers go back to England from Japan, Japanese teachers, but it's called an exchange because we're supposed to learn about Japan whilst we're here and then take the information back and tell English people about Japan.
Is it a program promoted by the Ministry of Education?
Yes, that's right, by Monbusho here in Japan, working in conjunction with the Ministry of Education back in England.
I see. And I understand, Tony, that Japan is not the only foreign country you've lived in so far, and where else have you lived?
Yes, well, in that sense, I suppose I've been rather lucky. Perhaps I should start by explaining that both my parents are teachers, and very early in their careers, they decided to leave Britain and teach English children living overseas in various parts of the British Commonwealth. This was back in the years when Britain had military forces stationed in many parts of the world. And so I started out by being born on the island of Malta. That's a small island in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea. I was there only for about 3 years. Then my parents were transferred to Scotland. That's where my sister was born. I have a younger sister. She was born in Scotland. And while she was still a baby, my parents decided to move again. And this time they went to Singapore. And that's really where I spent most of my childhood. So I always think of myself as having grown up in Singapore. Then I returned to England for a couple of years. But my father decided he would like to spend more time outside England, so he joined the military again as a civilian, and we went to Holland. I spent 4 years in Holland, and then finally to Italy for 2 years. And in Holland and Italy I had particularly interesting experiences because I was in an international school. In Singapore, the school was a British school for British forces children, but in Holland it was a NATO school actually, and then in Italy it was a school with, I think it was 36 different nationalities represented.
36?
My goodness. I'd like to ask you what are some of the more pleasant things about those international schools, or if you had any difficulties, what those were.
Yes, an interesting question. I think that the pleasantest thing was the fantastic opportunity I had to make friends with children and students from all over the world and learn about them and their cultures, the way they live. That was all very interesting. There was always an atmosphere of friendship at these schools, and it was nice to see, for example, the Israeli students and the Arab students sitting side by side, the Americans and the Russians sitting side by side, living and learning together. And I often used to think it was a pity that their governments couldn't see them and work a bit harder to settle their own political differences. As for difficulties, luckily there were very few. When I got to the senior levels of the school, there was a slight difficulty in that we had international classes in the NATO school, for example, which meant that we were studying under one teacher, but because we were going to different universities, some in England and some in America, the exams were really different. So we were faced with the problem of following one course, ending up in different exams.
Can you tell us a bit about the sort of examination you were preparing yourself for?
I was preparing for what's called the GCE, the General Certificate of Education. There are two levels, O-level, which we take at the age of 15 or 16, and then A-level, 2 years later, say 17 or 18 years old. And these A-levels are the key to entry into a British university. So I was studying for O-levels and A-levels, but my American friends, my Canadian friends, my German friends weren't interested in A-levels at all. So, their interests lay with different exams, the International Baccalaureate or for American university entrance exams.
And Tony, not very many people have had a chance to live in Malta, as you were saying earlier, but you and I seem to be among the few who've been there, as I did my teaching practice some time ago. And can you tell us something about that country, or do you still remember something other than...
Well, to tell the truth, I can't really remember very much because, as I was saying earlier, I left when I was about 3 or 4. My memories are very hazy.
Well, I think most people's memories are hazy when they're 3 years old or far back. Anyway, excuse me for asking a very simple question, but I simply don't know. What language do they speak there?
They speak a language called Maltese. It's interesting as Maltese because many people think of Malta as an island influenced by Italy.
Italy, yes, because geographically it's
that's right, it's very close.
Italy.
And of course there is influence from Italy, but historically it's much more closely related to the Arab world. And Maltese, the language, is related to Arabic. I remember, in fact, a few years ago, I met an Arab student. Now, when I was in Malta, I had learned just the numbers in Maltese, and I remembered them. And I was speaking to an Arab student, and I asked him about the numbers in Arabic, and he came out with a series of syllables, and I was astonished to find they were nearly the same as Maltese. That's when I realized how close Maltese and Arabic really were.
So what you remembered, somehow, over all those years, you remembered the numbers?
Yes, I did, yes. But that's about all, I'm afraid.
Well, and can you tell us a bit about your educational background, Tony? I think you went to university, but what university you went to and what you read there?
Well, when it was time for me to decide to go to university, I had the choice of joining a university in Italy. But on advice from my parents, I eventually decided to go back to my home country, Britain, and enter a university there. Since I'd been exposed to several different languages, I thought I'd like to do linguistics. And so I applied for Reading University. Reading is about maybe 50 miles west of London or so. And I studied there. I read linguistics for 4 years. It's a 4-year course, but the 3rd year of the course, we were obliged to go abroad for that whole year. And I divided my year into 2 halves, and I spent 6 months in Germany and 6 months in Holland.
And the name of the university, I'm afraid, is very often mispronounced, as its spelling is
yes, indeed,
isn't it?
It looks like reading, but it's pronounced Reading. And of course, the whole problem is compounded by the fact that in England we say we read a subject at university. So I wanted to read linguistics at Reading University. I read linguistics at Reading University, but we don't say Reading University.
And your university is known for good courses in applied linguistics, am I right?
Yes, it has made quite a name for itself over the years. They've managed to get together a pool of considerable talent in the field of linguistics, both pure and applied.
You said that you were required, I think during your third year, to go
That's
abroad,
right.
and you were in Germany and Holland. So what were you doing there?
Well, I was a sort of teacher/research assistant. I spent part of my time at Hanover University helping the staff there with the teaching of English, but I was also researching how German children acquire their language. And then I did this more or less the same thing in Holland. I went to Leiden University and spent 6 months there helping them to teach English and also studying child language acquisition in Holland amongst Dutch children.
Apart from talking about your education, Tony, I'd like to ask you a little bit more about yourself. I'm wondering what you do in your free time. In other words, what are your interests? I understand you're quite a pianist and also a chess player.
Well, I am a pianist and I am a chess player, but just an ordinary one. I do enjoy both the piano and chess. But since coming to Japan, I've also taken a great interest in calligraphy. Which is something, of course, unique Eastern calligraphy to Japan and China. It's something I'd never had a chance to study before, but I have become very interested indeed in it here. I also enjoy sports like tennis and skiing. Of course, Japan is good for both of those sports.
What about playing Japanese chess?
Shogi, yes. I am, but I'm still very weak, I'm afraid. I keep forgetting that once you take a piece, you can put it back on the board later.
Oh, yes. And does the study of calligraphy help you learn Japanese characters?
Oh, yes, indeed. My teachers of calligraphy, I've had several, have been pretty strict in their teaching. So I've learned quite a bit about the history of characters and how to write them correctly. And of course my general knowledge of the written language has certainly been improved, I think. But my general approach to spoken Japanese has been pretty unmethodical.
But what are some of the things which are most difficult for you to learn about the study of Japanese? I mean, learning kanji or other grammatical signals?
Well, I don't think that the grammar is too difficult if one is going to speak at a general conversational level. I think, of course, the keigo are very difficult. So when I'm speaking to somebody in a very high position, I do feel reluctant to speak Japanese then. Of course, kanji they do take time to acquire. But I see it as a very interesting challenge. So I've enjoyed learning kanji, but it just takes a lot of time.
What about pronunciation? Do you find it difficult?
Not particularly. Of course, I can't judge my own pronunciation in Japanese, but I don't think it's a very difficult language to pronounce.
We're talking about your study of Japanese, Tony, but you have studied a lot about linguistics and you've been here teaching English, and I'd just like to ask you if you have any quick hints for our listeners in terms of studying English. I'm sure you have lots of different ideas.
Yes, well, really I have so much to say I don't know where to begin. But I would say to people that perhaps the most important thing is constant practice and frequent contact with the language, which people can make themselves. They don't need somebody else to bring the language to them. I think that's perhaps the key.
With exposure to English.
That's right, yes. Expose themselves, not wait for it to come to them, but go to the language.
You say they can do it themselves. How?
Well,
by listening to the radio.
That's right, of course. By listening to the radio, by reading newspapers, magazines, by making contact with foreigners, pen pals, that sort of thing.
Well, I'm afraid, Tony, time is up, but we'll have you with us again next week, and I hope you can come to talk to us again.
I shall look forward to that very much.
Everybody, this concludes today's guest hour. Be sure to join us again. Till then, goodbye.
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 Welcome back to the guest hour, everyone. And hello, Tony. It's very delightful to have you with us again.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be back. Hello, everyone.
With your permission, I'd like to sum up what we talked about last week. Some of the listeners may not have been able to join us, so I'd just like to tell them that Mr. Newell was educated and spent his childhood in various countries around the world. He then returned to England, where he attended the University of Reading, where he read linguistics. For the past 5 years, he's been a lecturer at Saitama University. Well, Tony, my first question is about your foreign language learning experiences. Besides Japanese, what languages have you studied?
Well, as I was saying last week, and as you've just been summarizing, I was very fortunate as a youngster to have the opportunity of living in a number of different countries, and was therefore exposed to different languages from a very early age. However, I didn't in fact start to learn any of these languages seriously until I reached junior high school. For example, in Singapore, when I was an elementary school child, my mother wanted me to learn some Chinese, Cantonese, from one of the ladies who came to help her to do the cooking. And this young lady absolutely refused to teach me any Cantonese, saying that Chinese was an inferior language and that English was much better, and I shouldn't, as an Englishman, I shouldn't learn any Chinese at all. So she refused, I'm afraid, and that was a great pity. And now I wish I could speak Chinese. But once I entered junior high school, I started French and Latin. That's quite common in English schools, at least it was in those days. Later, I studied German, and then I went to Holland and joined a German school. So I was having lessons every day in German. And
how long did that continue?
That continued for about 18 months, because not all of that time was I in the German section of the school. At the same time, I was learning Dutch, because although it was a German school, it was actually in Holland. And Dutch and German are very similar. And so I was learning those two together. And then finally I went to Italy, and we had a rather strange situation there. We had classes in the morning in English and in the afternoon in Italian. But after a couple of years, I was getting along quite well with the Italian.
And after studying several languages, Tony, which language is the closest to English and the farthest from English? In other words, which language do you think is so much like English, or which one is not like English?
Well, in this sort of discussion, we really talk about historical relationships. And in terms of historical relationship, the closest language to English is a language called Frisian, which is spoken in the islands just north of Holland. Dutch also is very close to English, as is German. Indeed, we call English a Germanic language. So these three languages, German, Dutch, and English, plus the rather minor language Frisian, are all closely related. They form the West Germanic group. As for the farthest language from English, it's really impossible to say. There's no such thing. The reason for this is that there are many languages in the world totally unrelated to English, with no genetic relationship. And how we choose amongst these languages, well, there is no way of choosing. So we can't say that Japanese is the farthest, or Swahili is the farthest, or some American Indian language is the farthest. They're all distant, but there is no absolute
scale to measure the distance.
Right. Well, you mentioned these historical relationships, and you said that German is the closest, but I think at least among American students, the conception is if you are going to study a foreign language, Spanish is the easiest. And it seems to me that the pronunciation of Spanish is much easier for an English speaker than the pronunciation of German.
Yes, that's a very interesting observation. I was talking in historical terms, and in that sense, what I said does stand up. But we have to remember that although English began as a Germanic language, in 1066, the Norman invasion of England by William of Normandy, a French king, he introduced French, and when he became the King of England, of course, all the noblemen in England were speaking French. It's interesting to note, incidentally, that for several generations, the kings of England couldn't speak English at all. They only spoke French.
How strange.
And in the centuries following that, of course, the influence of French was very, very strong indeed. There was also Latin, which was the language of education. And these two, Latin and French, meant that the Romance group ultimately had a very, very far-reaching influence on English. Now, Spanish is a member of this Romance group, which would explain why Spanish seems quite close to English. If we look at the language today, then perhaps French, Spanish, Italian are all closer. They seem closer to English than German or Dutch. But I was talking in historical terms.
Well, in terms of that, do you mean that you find it easier to study German than to study Japanese, and also that a German student would find the study of English relatively easy?
Yes, right. I think, yes, I would say that it's certainly easier for me to study German or French or Italian than to study Japanese. And that's because, as I've been saying, English is related to these languages. And since my own language is related to these target languages, I don't find them too difficult to learn. The perceptual categories the linguistic categories are pretty familiar to me. When it comes to a language like Japanese, the language categories are quite different, and I have to see the world, the universe, through quite different eyes, and that takes a lot of doing. So yes, indeed, and I'm sure many of our listeners would say that English has been difficult for them to learn because they've got to see the world in a different light.
But it can be one of the values of learning foreign languages.
Oh, certainly. Yes. I think it's very important for people to try and learn a foreign language because that way they come to know themselves better. They really don't know their own culture or their own language until they have seen a foreign language and a foreign culture. If they don't see another language, another culture, they have no yardstick by which to measure their own.
That's true.
Well, do you think that, for example, for Japanese students and also perhaps for other students and maybe even native speakers themselves of the English language, that study of other languages, for example, Latin or German or French, helps reinforce the study of English?
Well, if an Englishman studies, say, French or German, I don't think it's going to really help him very much with his own language. Of course, he would learn in detail the history of many of the loan words in English, but it's not really going to help him. Latin is perhaps a different story, because we constantly use Latin, even today, as a source of making new words. But when it comes to a Japanese learning French or German or Latin, I would certainly recommend that because it will definitely help them. I know that many Japanese worry about perhaps interference. If they learn German, they're going to confuse it with English. Certainly, the languages are related, but I don't think they need to worry about interference. The advantages of learning another language, I think, far outweigh the disadvantages. I'd certainly recommend it. If they have learned English, they want to learn German, then their English will help them to learn German.
Well, in reference to the interference, and I'm rather critical of the excessive use of loan words in Japanese, terms like, say, a power up or something like that. And does English have as many, say, loan words as Japanese? And how do you think these terms should be dealt with?
Right. Well, I haven't actually counted the number of loan words in English or Japanese. Certainly, both languages are well known for having brought in a lot of loan words. English has been doing it for hundreds of years. I think that people criticize loan words here in Japan, and there is substance to their criticism when the words which are used have no meaning to the Japanese people as a whole. So if somebody uses some gairaigo just because it has an exotic feeling to it, or just because they're trying to sell something, that's not necessarily a good thing. On the other hand, I think that the loan words like teburu or fork and spoon and knife, they're all necessary because these implements weren't here before the words were introduced. So there was a definite need for these words. People sometimes talk about preserving the purity of a certain language, but that, quite frankly, is nonsense because there is no such thing as a pure language. English is really a composite mixture of many, and we can't talk about Japanese as a pure language either, because there's been tremendous influence from China with the introduction of kanji, of course. So I think that it's a good idea if it isn't taken to excess, if the use of loanwords isn't excessive. I think it's quite reasonable. However, I would point out that it's important to remember that once a word enters Japanese as a gairaigo, it is no longer an English word. It becomes a Japanese word, and it takes on its own color, let's say, and its own implications. So we have to be careful of that.
I'd like to ask you some questions now about culture. Do you think that the culture of the student, of the learner, affects the process of his foreign language learning?
Big question, isn't it? A very big question, yes. The answer is certainly it does. I don't think we can really divorce language from culture. Of course, if you're a tourist, you're going to a foreign language, you merely want to learn how to say, please give me a cup of tea, then it's not necessary to learn a great deal about the culture of that country. But if you want to learn a language seriously, then certainly you just cannot afford to ignore the culture. In terms of pure linguistics, talking about language categories, we are, in a sense, trained by our language to perceive the world around us in a way which is different from the way in which a speaker of another language sees the world. A few simple examples might serve to illustrate this. I remember when I came to Japan, I went to a restaurant and I got some tea which is too strong. So I wanted to ask for some hot water, and I asked for atsui mizu. And of course the waitress was astonished. What is this strange thing he wants? I didn't realize that there was a separate word for a category, hot water. In English, to us, water really is ice or water from 0 to 100 and then becomes steam. But up in the 80 and 90 degree range, there is no difference really to us. So
just Japanese, it's different.
Absolutely, yes. And of course, again, in terms of clothing, the verbs for clothing in Japanese, you have kiru and kaburu, hameru, haku. These were very puzzling to me. We just use wear for all of them. So it's certainly, there are definitely these language categories. There are many famous examples involving color terms in different languages of the world, about the way Eskimos categorize many types of snow, the way the Arab-speaking world categorizes many types of camel. It depends on what's important for that culture. Then to talk more about the social side, again, we have to be very careful. In apologizing, for example, we have to tread carefully. It can be a social lubricant or quite the opposite. So there are, I think, many problems in this field. We do have to be aware of culture.
Well, that's all the time we have today, Tony, and thank you very much indeed for coming to talk to us, and we had a great time.
Well, it was very nice being invited, so thank you very much indeed.
We certainly wish you the best of luck and a safe journey home.
Thank you.
Okay, this concludes this month's guest hour. So long, everyone.
Goodbye for now.
Cheerio, everybody.
の方に人がありますから。